The conference room doors swung open. Every head turned toward the woman who had not stood on her own in 20 years. Alyssa Vaughn walked in. No wheelchair, no cane. Each step slow, deliberate, like she was breaking a sentence that had lasted 2 decades. 17 doctors had sworn she would never recover. 17 specialists. 17 signatures on 17 files, all saying the same word. Permanent. But the man who changed that was not a doctor. He drove a delivery van for $11 an hour. So what exactly did he see that an entire medical system missed? The story began about 5 weeks before that morning, in a glass tower on the 32nd floor of the Vaughn Capitol building. The office belonged to a woman whose routine had not changed in nearly 2 decades. Alyssa Vaughn arrived at 7 reviewed markets until 9 and held meetings until noon, all from the same black wheelchair she had used since she was 26. The building was designed around her chair. Every doorway widened, every desk lowered, every elevator retrofitted. The world had been rebuilt to accommodate a body no one believed would ever move again. She ran Vaughn Capitol the way she ran her mornings, quietly, precisely, without complaint. The firm managed nearly $4 billion in assets, and in the financial press, her condition was no longer mentioned. It had become part of the furniture, like the gray carpet or the view of the river. Behind her always stood Leonard Hale, her late father's partner, her legal guardian during the first years after the accident, and now the chairman of the board. He had held her authority together when she could not hold it herself, and he had never stopped holding it since. That Tuesday, a delivery was scheduled for 10, a new server rack for the data room on the same floor. Nothing unusual. The driver came up through the service elevator with a pallet jack and a clipboard, wearing a gray uniform that had been washed too many times. His name tag read, Mercer. No one on the executive floor looked twice at him. They never did. Caleb Mercer had been driving for a logistics company for almost 3 years. Before that, he had been something else. A neurology resident then, and attending at a hospital in Boston, where he had once been considered one of the most careful diagnosticians in his department. None of that appeared on his uniform. He had walked away from the field after his wife died. From a tumor 3 radiologists had read as benign, and the paperwork he signed to leave medicine had been the cleanest thing he had ever filled out. He did not talk about it. He did not correct people who assumed he had never been anything but a driver. He wheeled the crate through the reception area and stopped at the frosted doors of the executive suite. A secretary buzzed him in. Inside, Alyssa Vaughn sat at her desk, reviewing a contract, and did not look up when he entered. Caleb was trained to scan rooms. It was a habit that had outlived the career that made it. His eyes moved from the desk to the floor, from the wheelchair to the footplates, and stopped. Her right foot had shifted. Not a twitch. A shift. A small adjustment of weight along the outer edge of the shoe, the kind of micro-movement a body makes when it rebalances itself without thinking. A paralyzed limb does not do that. A paralyzed limb rests where it is placed. He counted. 1, 2, 3. 8 seconds from the moment he entered to the moment he understood what he was seeing. The foot moved again almost imperceptibly when she turned to reach for a pen. Her ankle responded to the rotation of her hip. Somewhere between her spinal cord and her toes, signals were still traveling. Not cleanly. Not fully. But traveling. He should have said nothing. He knew that. A man in a gray uniform does not contradict the medical history of a woman who runs a $4 billion firm. He set the crate down and waited to be signed off. She reached for the clipboard without looking at him. "Ma'am," Caleb said, "your right foot is still reflexing." Her hand stopped halfway to the pen. The office was very quiet. For the first time in perhaps a year, Alyssa Vaughn looked up at a delivery driver and actually saw his face. He did not elaborate. He did not apologize. He simply held out the clipboard the way he had held out every clipboard that morning waiting for her signature. She signed. She did not speak. He left. The doors closed behind him, and the office returned to its normal silence. But something had been moved inside her that could not be moved back. For 2 days, she tried to dismiss it. She told herself the man had been mistaken or confused by the way the light fell through the blinds. She had been examined by 17 specialists over 20 years. She had been told the same thing in different words by every one of them. Permanent, irreversible, complete lower motor dysfunction consistent with the original trauma. 17 doctors do not miss what a stranger sees in 8 seconds. On the 3rd day, she pulled the delivery log herself. Leonard had people who would have done it for her, and those people would have told Leonard, and Leonard would have asked questions she did not want to answer. So she did it alone at 2 in the morning from the terminal in her private study. The log gave her a name, a vehicle number, and an employee ID. It did not give her what she wanted, which was a reason to stop. She arranged a meeting at a diner off Route 9, a place she had chosen because no one she knew had ever heard of it. Caleb arrived in the same gray uniform. He slid into the booth across from her without ceremony, set his cap on the table, and waited. She had rehearsed several ways to begin. None of them survived the moment she saw his face up close under the fluorescent light. "You were a physician," Alyssa said. It was not a question. He did not deny it. He did not confirm it either. Instead, he told her what he had seen. The micro shift in the foot, the ankle response to hip rotation, the slight asymmetry of tone along her right calf that would have been invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. He explained in the flat, economical language of someone who had said these things 1,000 times in a different life, that what he had observed was not consistent with the kind of paralysis her records described. "There is a condition," Caleb said. "It is called functional neurological disorder. The body stops moving, but the nerves are intact. The wiring is intact. The brain, for reasons we still do not fully understand, locks the signal at the gate. It looks like paralysis. It tests like paralysis. But it is not the same thing, and it does not follow the same rules." Alyssa listened without moving. Outside the window, a truck pulled into the parking lot and pulled out again. Her hands rested on the table between them, very still, the way they had rested for most of her adult life. "What are you telling me?" she said. "I am telling you that your diagnosis may have been wrong," Caleb replied. "I am not saying for certain. I am saying it is possible. And if it is, then the last 20 years of your life have been built on something that was never true." She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She folded her hands tighter and looked at them as if she had never seen them before. Behind her, the waitress poured coffee for a trucker at the counter. The world continued. Her world had stopped. "Why are you telling me this?" Alyssa asked. "You do not know me. You are not being paid. You could walk out of here and never see me again, and nothing in your life would change." Caleb looked at the window for a moment before answering. "My wife had cancer," he said. 3 men with better credentials than I will ever have told her. It was nothing. By the time someone looked a 4th time, there was no time left to look a 5th. I spent a year trying to find a reason why, and the only reason was that nobody wanted to be the one to say the previous 3 were wrong. He turned back to face her. "I do not want to be the one who saw something and said nothing." She nodded slowly. She understood him. They were in a way she would not have been able to articulate the same kind of survivor, standing on opposite sides of the same mistake. He finished his coffee. He did not offer to help her. He did not volunteer to treat her. He gave her a number on the back of a napkin. He told her there were 3 movements she could try alone at night, in a quiet room with the door locked. He left the diner before she did. She watched him cross the parking lot, climb into a delivery van that was not his, and drive away. She had a choice to make, and she understood it with perfect clarity even before she could put it into words. She could go back to the tower, to Leonard, to the 17 files, and the specialists, and the rebuilt doorways, and she could pretend this conversation had never happened. Or she could begin to ask a question that she had not been permitted to ask since she was 26 years old. Whether the sentence she had been serving was one she had ever deserved at all. The first movement Caleb had described was simple. Sit in a chair without the footrests, place both feet flat on the floor, close your eyes, and do not try to move. Just imagine the warmth of the floor under the right heel, and let the imagination run its course without expectation. Alyssa tried it that night in her bedroom with the door locked and the lights off. She sat on the edge of a low armchair she had asked the housekeeper to leave there without explanation. Her feet touched the hardwood. For almost an hour, nothing happened. Her back ached, her shoulders cramped from holding her own weight in a way she had not held it in years. She was about to give up when she felt a faint warmth along the arch of her right foot, the kind of sensation a person feels every day and never notices because every day it is assumed. She did not sleep. She sat with her feet on the floor until the sky turned gray outside the window, and she tried to convince herself she had imagined it. She could not. Something was there that had not been there the day before. Over the next 2 weeks, she ran the other 2 tests Caleb had given her. Each one produced a small, uncertain signal, a toe that curled when she thought about curling it, not reliably, but sometimes. A thigh that tightened under her palm when she braced to stand, even though standing was impossible. They were not recoveries. They were rumors of recovery, faint enough that any reasonable person would dismiss them, and she would have dismissed them too if she had not seen the look on Caleb's face in the diner. She began reading. She read about functional neurological disorder, the way she had once read quarterly reports methodically and without emotion. She read case studies of patients who had lost the ability to walk after trauma and regained it years later once the memory underneath the trauma had been addressed. She read about the way the brain in certain people stores a catastrophic event as a physical command. Do not move, do not run, do not resist. And the body obedient stops moving, sometimes for an afternoon, sometimes for decades. The language of it unsettled her. She had spent 20 years believing that her body had been broken by an accident. Now she was reading the possibility that her body had been held deliberately and without her knowledge by her own mind. That was when the first memory came back. It arrived in fragments, not like a door opening, but like water seeping under a door she had not known was there. A staircase, a voice raised behind her, a hand reaching for her shoulder, the smell of her father's hospital room, antiseptic, and old carnations. Her own voice saying a sentence she could not finish. And then nothing, which was where she had lived for 20 years. She did not know what the fragments meant. She only knew they had been waiting. Leonard noticed the change before she said a word to him. He had known her since she was 16. He read her silences the way other men read newspapers. At a Thursday review meeting, he watched her across the boardroom table and found her eyes focused on something that was not in the room. When the meeting ended, he stayed behind and closed the door. "You seem distracted, Alyssa," Leonard said. His voice was the same warm paternal register it had been for 2 decades. "Is there something I should know?" "I have been sleeping badly," she answered. It was not entirely a lie. "Nothing worth your attention." He studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he nodded, as if accepting the answer, and reminded her that the annual physical was scheduled for the following month. "Dr. Braun will come to the office as always. We will keep it brief." He placed a hand on the back of her chair just briefly, in the way a man touches something he considers his responsibility. Then he left. She did not move for some time after the door closed. Dr. Braun had been her attending physician for 19 of the 20 years she had been in the chair. He was on retainer with the firm. He was a friend of Leonard's from a club she had never been invited to join. That night, she pulled her own medical file from the private archive Leonard had set up in the early years, back when she had been too shattered to manage anything herself. The archive was encrypted, but her father had built the firm, and the encryption was ultimately keyed to her name. She worked through it slowly. She read the report from the accident, the one that had been filed the week she turned 26. Then she read the follow-up from 6 months later. Then the annual reviews, one by one stacked in order. She noticed it on the 4th review, a single phrase copied verbatim from the previous year's report. Complete lower motor dysfunction, non-progressive, non-responsive to stimulus testing. The exact same sentence, with the exact same punctuation, reappeared in the 5th review and the 6th and the 7th. 14 consecutive years, the same sentence written, as if no one had actually examined her at all. She kept reading. She found entries for stimulus tests that by the dates had been scheduled for days she had been out of the country. She found references to an MRI taken in a city she had never visited. She found prescriptions filled under her name for medications she had never taken. The whole file was a house built of paper, and when she looked at it closely, she could see the paper had been cut from the same sheet over and over again. Somebody had been maintaining her diagnosis, not treating it. Maintaining it. She called Caleb from a disposable phone. They met at the same diner off Route 9 at the same booth. She told him what she had found. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he looked down at his coffee for a long while before speaking. "That changes things," Caleb said quietly. "If the records have been falsified, then the question is no longer whether you were misdiagnosed. The question is whether anyone ever intended for you to recover." The sentence landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She had been preparing herself to be the victim of an honest mistake. She had not prepared herself for this. "Why," she said. It was the only word she could manage. "I do not know the answer to that question," he told her. "But you do. You just have not let yourself ask it yet." She went home that night and sat in her study with the archive open on the screen in front of her, and for the first time since she was 26 years old, she let herself remember the week before her accident. Her father had been dying. Cancer of the pancreas diagnosed too late to do anything about. She had been 26 and running a division of the firm, and she had gone to the office late one night to pull a file for him because he still wanted to look at the numbers even from his hospital bed. And in that file, she had found something that had not made sense. A transfer of funds to a holding company she did not recognize. A pattern of transfers going back years. A name that kept appearing as the signatory. Leonard Hale. She had confronted him that night in his office, in the building she now ran. She remembered the staircase outside his office, the old marble one from the original construction, the one that had been closed off a year later and replaced with a service elevator. She remembered the argument. She remembered Leonard telling her that her father had known that her father had authorized it, that if she exposed any of it, the firm would collapse and her father would die, knowing she had destroyed his life's work. She remembered not believing him. She remembered walking away. She remembered the top of the staircase. After that, there was the fragment, the voice behind her, the hand, the fall, the emergency room, the diagnosis. Her father had died 4 days later without knowing she had fallen because Leonard had told him she was away on business. Everything after that was the chair. She sat in her study with her hands in her lap, and she understood with the same clarity she had felt in the diner that her body had not betrayed her. Her mind had protected her. It had taken a truth she could not survive at 26, a father dying, a mentor stealing a fall she could not remember, and it had locked every door in the house. The paralysis was the lock. The forgetting was the key hidden from herself. She did not go to the office the next morning. She stayed in her study and worked through the archive again this time, looking for the financial trail her 26-year-old self had found. It was still there, layered under 2 decades of cleaner records, but the bones were unmistakable. Leonard had been draining capital from the firm since before her father got sick, and the drain had not stopped when she took over. It had simply moved, rerouted through accounts that were now signed off by a woman who had not been able to verify anything for herself in a very long time. She was 3 hours into the records when her secretary called. Leonard had requested an emergency board meeting for the following Monday. The topic, per the circulated memo, was a review of executive fitness. She understood what that meant before she finished reading the sentence. Caleb called her that evening. His voice was different. Tight controlled the voice of a man standing on a sidewalk, watching a fire he could not put out. "I received a letter this afternoon," Caleb said, "from a firm that represents Vaughn Capital. They are preparing a civil action against me. Harassment of an executive, unauthorized medical advice, impersonation of a licensed physician in the state of New York. They are asking for an injunction that would prevent me from contacting you directly or indirectly pending trial." She closed her eyes. "How fast?" "Filed tomorrow morning, served by the end of the week," he answered. "I will not be able to speak to you after that. Not on the phone, not in person, not through any intermediary." She sat with the news for a moment. She had expected Leonard to fight. She had not expected him to move this quickly or this precisely. Somewhere in the last few days he had seen the shape of what was coming, even if he could not yet see the whole of it. He was not a man who waited to be certain before he acted. "I am sorry," she told him. "I brought this on to you." "No," Caleb said. "I walked into your office with my eyes open. I said what I said because I wanted to say it. Whatever happens to me happens. What matters is what happens to you. You cannot win this by being quiet. Not anymore. He has already made that choice for you." She understood that, too. They did not speak for long after that. There was nothing more to plan. He wished her well. She thanked him for the 8 seconds. He did not laugh, but she could hear him smile on the other end of the line. Then they hung up, and she knew she would not hear his voice again for a long time. The days leading up to the board meeting passed like water through a clenched fist. Leonard was courteous. He visited her office twice each time with small items of business that required no decision, and each time his eyes lingered on her longer than they ever had. He was measuring her. He was looking for the crack that would tell him whether she had figured it out, and if so, how much. She gave him nothing. She had spent 20 years learning how to give nothing from the neck down. Giving nothing from the neck up was a smaller skill. On the night before the meeting, she sat alone in her study again, with the lights off, and she tried the first movement. The foot on the floor. The imagined warmth along the arch. She did not expect anything, and so she was not disappointed when nothing came. She stayed there anyway until the sky outside her window began to turn the color of old paper. Somewhere near dawn, she realized she was going to have to walk into that boardroom on her own. Not figuratively. Actually, walk. Because if she rolled in one more time in the chair Leonard had built his entire scheme around, he would win. The chair was the story. The chair was the proof. As long as she came in sitting down, she would always be the woman he had described her to be. And if she tried to walk, and her body refused her, she would be finished. He would take the firm, he would bury the records, and by the time anyone looked closely, there would be nothing left to look at. Caleb would be destroyed in court for sport. Every door her mind had closed to keep her alive would shut again, and no one would come looking for her behind them. She understood, as the light came up over the river, that this was the lowest place she had ever stood. She was being asked to trust a body that had not obeyed her in 20 years, on the word of a man she had met briefly in a delivery bay, against a man who had raised her after her father died, and who now held every instrument of her destruction in his hands. She sat at the edge of the armchair and put both feet on the floor. She closed her eyes. She did not know yet whether she could walk. She only knew for the first time in 20 years that she was going to try. The first light of morning found her still on the edge of the armchair. She had not moved in almost 2 hours. Her hands rested palm down on her thighs, and she was not thinking about the boardroom, or about Leonard, or about the files on the encrypted drive in the next room. She was thinking about the staircase. She let herself walk back to it in her mind. The old marble staircase, the one that had been closed off within a year of her accident. and quietly removed from the building plans. She remembered the cold of the banister under her hand. She remembered Leonard's voice behind her, saying her father's name, saying the firm's name, saying that she did not understand what she had found. She remembered turning to face him at the top step. She remembered his hand on her shoulder. Not pushing. Not yet. Just resting there, the way a man rests a hand on a thing he owns. She remembered looking into his eyes and understanding for the first time that the man who had driven her home from her mother's funeral at 17 was also the man who had been stealing from her father for more than a decade. And she remembered the decision on his face when he realized she was not going to let it go. The fall came next. The memory was not cinematic. It was a single sensation of the floor rising up to meet her and the sound her own skull made against the bottom step. She had been awake for some of it. She had heard Leonard's shoes on the marble as he walked down to her unhurried. She had heard him call for help only after he had checked her pulse twice, as if deciding whether to. Her mind had done the only thing it could do for her. It had closed. It had taken the truth of that night and wrapped it in a diagnosis, and it had held her still for 20 years, so that the truth would not have to be survived. She understood, sitting in the armchair with the sky turning pale outside, that her body had never been broken. Her body had been keeping her alive, and now her body was ready to let her stand, because she was finally ready to know what it had been protecting her from. She pressed her palms against her thighs and shifted her weight forward onto her feet. Her right knee trembled. Her left held. She pushed up through the heel slowly the way Caleb had described in the third movement, the one she had never been able to complete. Her quadriceps engaged. Her hips lifted. She rose unsteady with both hands gripping the arms of the chair for balance, and she stood. She stood for perhaps 10 seconds before her knees gave out, and she sat down again. But she had stood. Something that had held for 20 years had finally given way. She spent the next hour teaching herself how to repeat it. By the time the sun was fully up, she could stand without holding on. By the time her driver arrived to take her to the office, she could take 4 steps across the study floor before her balance failed. She did not tell the driver. She let him lift her into the car the way he did every morning, and she rode to the Vaughn Capitol building with her hands folded in her lap, and she watched the city go by outside the tinted window as if she were seeing it for the last time. In a sense, she was. The board had assembled on the 32nd floor, 9 directors around the long walnut table, Leonard at the head. Dr. Braun was seated along one wall, his leather case open on his knees, prepared to testify to her cognitive decline. The chair she normally used had been positioned at the foot of the table, a subtle choreography that placed her below Leonard rather than across from him. Everything in the room had been arranged to tell a story. She intended to tell a different one. She had asked her assistant to leave the wheelchair in the corridor outside. The assistant had protested briefly and then complied, because in 20 years, Alyssa Vaughn had never given an instruction she did not mean. She stood in the corridor for a full minute, with one hand against the wall. She breathed in. She breathed out. She stepped away from the wall. The conference room doors swung open at 10 past the hour. Every head turned. Leonard's face did something she had never seen it do in 20 years. It went still. Not shocked. Not afraid. Still. The way a man goes still when he realizes the board he has been playing against has placed a piece he did not know was on it. She walked to the foot of the table. She did not sit. She placed both hands flat on the walnut and looked down its length at the man who had raised her and buried her in the same gesture. "Leonard," Alyssa said. Her voice was level. "I understand you called this meeting to discuss my fitness to lead this firm. I appreciate the courtesy. I would like to use the time to discuss yours." The room did not move. Dr. Braun closed his case very slowly, as if any sudden motion might draw attention to him. One of the directors, a woman who had served on the board for 11 years and had always been quietly loyal to Alyssa's father, leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Alyssa opened the folder she had carried in under her arm. She laid the first document on the table, then the second, then the third. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She described. She described the repeated sentence in 14 consecutive medical reviews, word for word, comma for comma. She described the stimulus tests scheduled on days she had been out of the country, the MRI taken in a city she had never visited, the prescriptions filled under her name for medications she had never taken. She described the holding company her 26-year-old self had found in her father's file the week he was dying. She described the pattern of transfers going back years. She read the name of the signatory. She read it twice so that no one would need to ask her to repeat it. Then she described the staircase. She did this briefly without drama, the way a witness describes a car accident to an insurance adjuster. The old marble staircase, the conversation at the top, the hand on the shoulder, the fall. She did not name what Leonard had done, because the room could name it for itself. She simply said that she had spent 20 years unable to remember, and that she had remembered now, and that she was prepared to testify to every detail. Leonard did not defend himself. He could have. He had the standing to interrupt, to demand procedure, to declare the meeting out of order. He did none of it. He watched her across the length of the table, and he understood what the room already understood. The story he had spent 20 years telling had just been told back to him in full. The woman who had served under Alyssa's father stood up. She moved to call for a vote. It was not the vote Leonard had convened the meeting to hold. By the end of the afternoon, Leonard Hale had been removed from the board, his signatory authority had been frozen, and the firm's general counsel had been instructed to open an internal review of every financial transaction bearing his name, going back more than 2 decades. The matter would ultimately pass to the district attorney's office. The staircase would remain outside the scope of any criminal charge, because the evidence was memory, and the witness was a woman who had not been believed for a very long time. But the firm would be made clean. That much she could do. Dr. Braun left the building without speaking to anyone. His retainer was terminated by the close of business. She walked out of the conference room the way she had walked in, slowly, without the chair. A few of the directors offered to help her. She thanked them and declined. The civil action against Caleb was withdrawn within the week. No one made an announcement. The file simply closed the way such files close, when the party that filed them loses the power to pursue them. Alyssa did not contact him immediately. She wanted him to know that what she did next, she did for herself, and not because she owed him anything. She began a structured program of physical rehabilitation under a neurologist she found on her own at a clinic that had no connection to Vaughn Capital and no knowledge of her name. Recovery from functional neurological disorder is rarely clean and almost never fast. There were days when her legs refused her days, when the memory of the staircase returned without warning, and her knees buckled in the middle of a corridor. She learned to rest when the signal failed, and to try again when it returned. She learned that healing was not an event, but a long, patient argument with her own nervous system, conducted a few minutes at a time. She wrote to Caleb after 3 months, a short letter. She did not offer him a position at the firm because she understood he would not take one. She told him that the review of her records had confirmed everything he had observed that morning in her office. She told him that she had begun to walk. She told him that, if he ever wanted to return to medicine, she knew of several clinics that would be glad to have a man who had lost his wife to a misread scan and who had been unable, in the years since, to stop seeing what other doctors did not bother to look for. He wrote back. He did not promise. He said he would think about it. A year later, he was working again at a small neurology practice outside Albany, consulting on cases that other physicians had given up on. He wore a white coat instead of a gray uniform. He did not advertise what he had once almost lost. On the first anniversary of the board meeting, Alyssa walked the length of the 32nd floor corridor without stopping. Her assistant noted the time for no reason, except that it seemed worth noting. 4 minutes and 12 seconds from the elevator to her office door. She closed the door behind her and sat down at her desk. The truth she had come to understand was not the thing most people thought it was. It was not something the world showed you. It was something you had to be strong enough to look at after a very long time of being told to look away. Sometimes that strength came from a specialist with 17 degrees. Sometimes it came from a man in a gray uniform in a quiet room on the 32nd floor in the space of a single breath. She opened her laptop. She began her morning review. Outside the window, the river moved the way it had always moved, and for the first time in 20 years, so did she.